Picture this: a young woman sits in the corner of a military briefing room, invisible to the seasoned pilots around her. They see her uniform and assume she's there to serve coffee or take notes. What they don't know is that in less than 48 hours, she'll be flying solo through enemy territory, facing four of the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter jets with nothing but her skills, determination, and a plane that wasn't even supposed to be in combat. This isn't Hollywood fiction. This is the true story of Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Martinez, whose single mission on a cold December morning in 1987 would rewrite the rules of aerial combat and shatter every assumption about what women could achieve in the cockpit of a fighter jet. The military brass had plans for her. The enemy pilots had expectations. Her own squadron had doubts. But Sarah Martinez had something none of them counted on: the heart of a warrior and the reflexes of a born fighter pilot. What happened in the skis over Eastern Europe that day would become the stuff of legend, turning a support crew member into one of the most feared aces in aviation history. Get ready to witness how one woman turned the aviation world upside down, one impossible maneuver at a time. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had grown used to being invisible. Every morning at 600 hours, she walked through the corridors of Air Base in West Germany, her flight suit crisp and her boots polished to perfection. The other pilots barely glanced her way. To them, she was just another support officer, someone who handled logistics or maintenance schedules. They had no idea that behind her calm exterior burned the heart of a fighter pilot who had logged more flight hours than half the squadron combined. Sarah's journey to this moment had been anything but conventional. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had spent her childhood watching her grandfather restore vintage aircraft in his hangar. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, Sarah was learning about engine mechanics and aerodynamics. Her grandfather, a World War II veteran who had flown bombing missions over Germany, recognized something special in his granddaughter's eyes when she talked about flying. He began teaching her the fundamentals of aviation before she could even reach the pedals of his old. By the time Sarah turned 16, she was already a licensed pilot with more hours in the air than most adults. Her high school guidance counselor tried to steer her toward traditional careers for women in the 1980s, but Sarah had already made up her mind. She wanted to serve her country as a fighter pilot, even though the military had strict policies preventing women from flying combat missions. When Sarah enlisted in the Air Force after graduating high school with honors, she knew the odds were stacked against her. The military establishment in 1985 was still dominated by men who believed that women belonged in support roles, not in the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon. During basic training, her drill instructors were skeptical of her abilities until she consistently outperformed her male counterparts in every physical and mental challenge they threw at her. Flight school proved to be another battle entirely. Sarah excelled in every aspect of pilot training, from navigation to aerial maneuvers, but the institutional bias was clear. While her male classmates were fast-tracked into fighter pilot programs, Sarah found herself assigned to transport and support missions. The instructors praised her skills, but explained that combat roles were simply not available to women, regardless of their capabilities. The assignment to Air Base in West Germany came with mixed emotions. On one hand, Sarah was thrilled to be stationed at one of the most strategically important bases in Europe during the height of the Cold War. On the other hand, her official role was as a support pilot, responsible for flying supply missions and providing backup for training exercises. She spent her days watching F-16s take off on combat air patrols, while she was relegated to flying cargo planes filled with spare parts and medical supplies. What the squadron commanders didn't know was that Sarah had been spending her off-duty hours studying every aspect of fighter jet operations. She memorized technical manuals, analyzed combat footage from previous conflicts, and even convinced some of the maintenance crew to let her inspect the F-16s up close. Her photographic memory absorbed every detail about the aircraft's capabilities, from its maximum speed and turning radius to the optimal firing solutions for its mounted cannons and missile systems. The other pilots in the squadron slowly began to notice Sarah's extensive knowledge during briefings and debriefings. When technical questions arose about aircraft performance or enemy capabilities, Sarah often had insights that surprised even the veteran pilots. However, most of them attributed her knowledge to her support role rather than recognizing her as a potential combat pilot. Captain Mike Thunder was one of the few pilots who took Sarah seriously. A decorated veteran with 12 years of flying experience, Mike had worked with Sarah on several training missions and had seen her natural flying abilities firsthand. During one particularly challenging weather exercise, Sarah had navigated through a severe thunderstorm with precision that impressed even the most experienced pilots in the squadron. The tension at Air Base had been escalating throughout 1987, as intelligence reports indicated increased Soviet military activity along the East German border. The Cold War was entering a critical phase, with both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces conducting regular reconnaissance missions that often resulted in dangerous encounters between opposing aircraft. The pilots knew that at any moment, they could be called upon to defend Western European airspace against potential Soviet incursions. Sarah found herself in a unique position during this period of heightened tension. Her support role gave her access to intelligence briefings and mission planning sessions, even though she was not expected to participate in actual combat operations. She listened carefully as the squadron leaders discussed Soviet tactics and aircraft capabilities, mentally preparing herself for scenarios that she hoped she would never have to face. The Soviet Union had been deploying their most advanced fighter jets along the European border, including the fearsome MiG-29 Fulcrum. These aircraft represented the cutting edge of Soviet aviation technology, equipped with sophisticated radar systems and armed with deadly air-to-air missiles. NATO pilots respected the MiG-29's capabilities, knowing that any encounter with these aircraft would require exceptional skill and courage. As winter approached, the frequency of Soviet reconnaissance flights increased dramatically. NATO forces responded by stepping up their own patrol missions, creating an atmosphere of constant vigilance along the border. The pilots had found themselves on high alert, with aircraft fully armed and ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Sarah watched these developments with growing frustration. The alarm bells that shattered the pre-dawn silence at Air Base on December 15, 1987, carried an urgency that every pilot recognized immediately. Sarah Martinez bolted upright in her bunk, her mind instantly alert despite having been awakened from a deep sleep. The scramble alert meant one thing: Soviet aircraft had been detected crossing into NATO airspace, and interceptor aircraft needed to launch immediately. Within minutes, the squadron briefing room filled with pilots in various states of readiness. Some had managed to pull on their flight suits completely, while others were still zipping up boots and adjusting equipment. The atmosphere was electric with tension and adrenaline. This was not a drill or training exercise. This was the real thing that every pilot had been preparing for during their entire military career. Colonel Harrison stood at the front of the room, his weathered face grave as he pointed to the tactical display screen showing radar contacts along the East German border. 4 Soviet MiG-29 aircraft had penetrated 20 miles into West German airspace and were maintaining course toward a strategic NATO communications facility. Their intentions were unclear, but the violation of sovereign airspace could not go unanswered. The colonel's voice cut through the murmur of concerned pilots as he outlined the mission parameters. 2 F-16s would launch immediately to intercept the Soviet aircraft and escort them back across the border. If the MiGs refused to comply with international protocols or showed any hostile intent, the NATO pilots were authorized to engage with deadly force to protect the vital communications installation. As Sarah listened to the briefing, she felt the familiar frustration of being relegated to the sidelines during the most important mission the squadron had faced in months. She watched as the colonel assigned the intercept mission to captain and lieutenant, 2 experienced pilots with solid combat training records. Both men were already moving toward the door to begin their pre-flight procedures when disaster struck. Lieutenant suddenly doubled over, clutching his stomach with obvious agony. The young pilot had been fighting a stomach virus for the past 2 days, but had hidden his illness to avoid being grounded. The stress and adrenaline of the emergency scramble had triggered a violent attack that left him unable to stand upright, much less pilot a high-performance fighter jet in a potential combat situation. Colonel Harrison cursed under his breath as he quickly scanned the room for available replacement pilots. The squadron was operating with a skeleton crew due to several pilots being away on temporary duty assignments and training courses. Of the remaining pilots present, most were either too inexperienced for such a critical mission or were already assigned to backup roles for other potential scenarios. Captain stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. He insisted that he could handle the intercept mission alone, arguing that one experienced pilot was better than risking the mission with an inadequately trained wingman. The colonel considered this option for a long moment, knowing that single aircraft intercepts were extremely dangerous, especially when facing multiple enemy fighters. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized the implications of the situation unfolding before her. This was exactly the kind of scenario she had been mentally preparing for during all those hours of studying combat tactics and aircraft capabilities. She knew every specification of both the F-16 and the MiG-29, had memorized the standard intercept procedures, and possessed flying skills that she was confident could match any pilot in the squadron. Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah stepped forward and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried across the briefing room. She volunteered to serve as captain's wingman for the intercept mission, citing her extensive knowledge of the aircraft systems and her current flight qualification status. The room fell silent as every person present processed the unprecedented nature of her request. Several of the male pilots exchanged incredulous glances, unable to believe that a support pilot was volunteering for what could easily become a combat mission. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others looked to Colonel Harrison to see how he would respond to such an audacious suggestion. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the colonel's decision. Colonel Harrison studied Sarah's face intently, seeing determination and confidence rather than reckless bravado. He had been quietly impressed by her performance in training exercises and had read the glowing reports from her flight instructors about her natural abilities. However, assigning a woman to a potential combat mission went against every established protocol and could result in serious career consequences for everyone involved. Captain surprised everyone by speaking up in support of Sarah's proposal. He had flown with her during training exercises and had witnessed her exceptional flying skills firsthand. More importantly, he trusted her judgment and believed that her technical knowledge of both friendly and enemy aircraft would make her an asset rather than a liability during the intercept mission. The clock on the briefing room wall showed that precious minutes were ticking away, while the Soviet MiGs continued their penetration into NATO airspace. Every moment of delay increased the risk that the enemy aircraft would reach their target or that additional Soviet fighters might join the incursion. Colonel Harrison faced a decision that would define his career and potentially change military policy forever. After what seemed like an eternity but was actually only 30 seconds, the colonel made his choice. He authorized Sarah to fly as wingman for the intercept mission, with strict orders to follow Captain's lead and avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary for self-defense or mission success. The room erupted in surprised murmurs, but the colonel's stern glare quickly restored order. Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror as she realized that her moment had finally arrived. All the years of training, studying, and waiting had led to this opportunity to prove herself in the most challenging environment imaginable. She nodded curtly to acknowledge her orders, and then followed Captain toward the door, trying to project confidence despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. The pre-flight preparation process passed in a blur of activity as Sarah went through the familiar checklist procedures that she had practiced hundreds of times in training. However, this time was different because the aircraft was armed with live ammunition and missiles, and the mission ahead carried real consequences for international relations and potentially for human lives. As she strapped herself into the cockpit of the F-16, Sarah felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. She was about to become the first woman to fly a combat mission in a U.S. Air Force fighter aircraft, though the official records would never reflect this achievement due to the classified nature of the operation and the military's policies regarding women in combat roles. The ground crew chief approached her aircraft for the final pre-flight inspection, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. He had worked with Sarah on numerous occasions and respected her professionalism, but he had never seen her prepare for a mission with such high stakes. He gave her a thumbs-up signal and stepped back as the powerful engines of both F-16s roared to life. Captain's voice crackled through the radio as he confirmed their flight plan and mission parameters. The two aircraft would launch immediately and climb to 30,000 feet while proceeding toward the intercept coordinates provided by ground control radar. Their objective was to visually identify the Soviet aircraft, establish radio contact, and escort them back across the border using standard international protocols. As Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the familiar surge of acceleration down the runway, She pushed aside all thoughts of the historic nature of her mission and focused entirely on the tactical situation ahead. The MiG-29s were formidable opponents with advanced radar systems and deadly air-to-air missiles, and any mistake on her part could have catastrophic consequences for both herself and her wingman. The first visual contact with the Soviet MiG-29s came at a distance of 15 miles, appearing as tiny silver specks against the gray winter sky over eastern Germany. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she confirmed the radar contacts through her F-16's heads-up display, watching the four enemy aircraft maintain their aggressive formation while continuing their penetration into NATO airspace. The morning sun created a brilliant glare that made visual identification challenging, but there was no mistaking the distinctive silhouette of the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter jets. Captain's voice crackled through the radio with calm professionalism as he initiated the standard intercept protocols. He established radio contact with the lead MiG pilot using the International Emergency Frequency, identifying himself as a NATO interceptor and requesting immediate clarification of the Soviet aircraft's intentions. The response came back in heavily accented English, with the MiG leader claiming navigation equipment failure and requesting assistance in returning to friendly airspace. Sarah listened to the exchange while maintaining her position slightly behind and to the right of Captain's aircraft. Her training had taught her to remain vigilant during such encounters because apparent mechanical failures had been used as deception tactics in previous incidents. The Soviet pilots were flying with too much precision and coordination for aircraft experiencing genuine navigation problems, and their formation positioning suggested tactical awareness rather than confusion. The lead MiG pilot continued to insist that his flight had encountered equipment malfunctions while conducting a routine training mission near the border. However, intelligence reports had indicated no scheduled Soviet training activities in this sector, and the MiG-29s were flying directly toward one of NATO's most sensitive communications installations. Captain maintained his diplomatic tone while maneuvering his F-16 into a position where he could visually inspect the Soviet aircraft for any obvious signs of mechanical distress. As the distance between the opposing formations closed to within 5 miles, Sarah began to notice subtle tactical movements that suggested the Soviet pilots were not as helpless as they claimed. The MiGs were gradually adjusting their formation to create optimal firing solutions while maintaining the appearance of cooperating with the intercept procedures. Her extensive study of Soviet tactics had prepared her to recognize these maneuvers, and she quickly alerted Captain to the developing threat. The situation escalated dramatically when ground control radar detected 4 additional Soviet aircraft approaching rapidly from the east. These new contacts were identified as MiG-23s flying at low altitude in an apparent attempt to avoid early detection by NATO radar systems. The arrival of reinforcements transformed what had appeared to be a navigation error into a coordinated military operation with unknown objectives but clearly hostile intent. Captain immediately radioed for additional NATO support while simultaneously beginning evasive maneuvers to avoid being trapped between the 2 groups of Soviet aircraft. However, the nearest friendly fighters were at least 20 minutes away, leaving Sarah and her wingman alone against 8 enemy aircraft in one of the most dangerous situations imaginable for military aviators. The odds had shifted from challenging to nearly impossible in a matter of seconds. The lead MiG pilot abandoned all pretense of cooperation when he realized that his deception had been discovered. His aircraft suddenly broke formation and executed a sharp climbing turn that brought his nose around toward the 2 F-16s in an unmistakably aggressive maneuver. The other 3 MiG-29s followed suit, spreading out to establish tactical positions that would allow them to engage the NATO fighters from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah felt time slow down as her mind processed the rapidly changing tactical situation. Her training kicked in automatically, and she began executing defensive maneuvers to avoid presenting an easy target for the Soviet missiles. The F-16's superior maneuverability gave her some advantage, but the MiG-29s outnumbered her flight 2-to-1 and possessed their own formidable capabilities that could not be underestimated. The first missile launch came without warning as one of the trailing MiGs fired an AA-11 Archer air-to-air missile at Captain's aircraft. The missile's smoke trail was clearly visible against the winter sky as it accelerated rapidly toward its target. Guided by an advanced infrared seeker, that locked onto the heat signature of the F-16's engine exhaust. Sarah watched in horror as her wingman threw his aircraft into a desperate series of evasive maneuvers, while deploying chaff and flares to confuse the incoming weapon. Captain's voice filled the radio frequency with urgent warnings as he fought to evade the Soviet missile while simultaneously trying to coordinate a response to the attack. The AA-11 missed its target by mere feet, detonating harmlessly in the empty air after being successfully decoyed by the F-16's countermeasures. However, the near miss served as a stark reminder of how quickly the situation could turn deadly for both NATO pilots. Sarah found herself separated from Captain as the aerial combat spread across several miles of airspace. The Soviet pilots were executing classic tactics designed to isolate individual enemy fighters and overwhelm them with superior numbers. She realized that her survival depended on maintaining situational awareness while avoiding the temptation to engage targets beyond her capabilities as a lone fighter against multiple opponents. The second group of MiG-23s had climbed to join the engagement, creating a chaotic three-dimensional battle that tested every aspect of Sarah's flying skills and tactical knowledge. The older MiG-23s were less capable than their MiG-29 counterparts, but they still represented deadly threats with experienced pilots who understood how to use their weapons effectively in combat situations. Captain found himself engaged in a turning fight with two MiG-29s that were attempting to gain position for missile shots. His F-16's superior turning radius allowed him to avoid their initial attacks, but the sustained maneuvering was rapidly depleting his fuel reserves, while the Soviet pilots could afford to be patient with their numerical advantage. Sarah realized that her wingman was in serious trouble and needed immediate assistance to survive the encounter. The moment that would define Sarah Martinez's place in aviation history began when Captain's desperate voice crackled through her headset, reporting that his aircraft had suffered critical damage from a Soviet cannon burst. His F-16 was trailing smoke and losing hydraulic pressure, forcing him to disengage from the fight and attempt an emergency return to base. Sarah watched in dismay as her wingman's aircraft limped away from the battle area, leaving her alone against four MiG-29s and four MiG-23s, whose pilots now sensed blood in the water. The Soviet formation immediately adjusted their tactics to focus all attention on the remaining NATO fighter. They had expected to face two experienced male pilots, and instead found themselves pursuing a lone aircraft whose pilot was demonstrating flying skills that their expectations. The lead MiG-29 pilot, Major, was a decorated veteran of the Afghan War with 12 confirmed kills who had never encountered an opponent capable of matching his aggressive flying style. Sarah felt the weight of impossible odds settling on her shoulders as she surveyed the tactical situation through her radar display. 8 enemy fighters were maneuvering to surround her aircraft, while additional Soviet reinforcements were reportedly en route to the engagement area. Her fuel gauge showed that she had perhaps 15 minutes of combat flying time remaining, after which she would be forced to either land at a Soviet airbase or attempt a dead-stick landing in hostile territory. The first coordinated attack came from multiple directions simultaneously as the Soviet pilots attempted to overwhelm her ability to defend against simultaneous threats. 2 MiG-29s approached from her left flank, while a MiG-23 climbed from below to establish a missile firing solution. The remaining aircraft positioned themselves to block potential escape routes, creating a three-dimensional trap that should have been impossible for any single pilot to evade. Sarah's response shocked even the most experienced Soviet aviators. Instead of attempting to flee or fight defensively, she rolled her F-16 inverted and dove directly toward the Earth at maximum afterburner power. The unexpected maneuver forced the attacking MiGs to break off their coordinated assault to avoid collision with their own wingmen. Her aircraft screamed downward through 20,000 feet of altitude in less than 90 seconds, trading height for the energy she would need to survive the engagement. At 8,000 feet above the frozen German countryside, Sarah leveled her F-16 and immediately began a series of high-G turning maneuvers that pushed both her aircraft and her own physical endurance to their absolute limits. The violent maneuvers subjected her body to forces approaching 9 times the pull of gravity, causing her vision to narrow and her muscles to strain against the crushing weight. However, her exceptional physical conditioning and mental preparation allowed her to maintain consciousness and situational awareness throughout the ordeal. The pursuing MiGs found themselves unable to match the extreme performance envelope that Sarah was operating within. The Soviet pilots were skilled and experienced, but they had never encountered an opponent willing to risk structural failure of their aircraft in order to gain tactical advantage. Several of the MiG-23s were forced to abandon their pursuit when their older airframes reached design limitations that prevented them from matching the F-16's sustained turning performance. Major, flying the lead MiG-29, was both impressed and frustrated by his opponent's flying abilities. In all his years of combat experience, he had never faced a NATO pilot capable of such precision and aggression under extreme pressure. He began to suspect that he was fighting one of America's most elite test pilots, or perhaps a veteran of some classified combat program that Soviet intelligence had failed to detect. The aerial battle had evolved into a deadly spiral dance, as Sarah used every advantage of her F-16's superior maneuverability to avoid missile locks while searching for opportunities to engage individual Soviet aircraft. Her strategy was based on creating momentary windows of vulnerability when enemy fighters became separated from their mutual support formations. The tactic required perfect timing and split-second decision-making that left no margin for error. Sarah's first victory came when one of the MiG-23 pilots became overconfident and attempted to pursue her through a series of vertical maneuvers that exceeded his aircraft's capabilities. The Soviet pilot found himself in a stall condition at low altitude with insufficient energy to recover safely. Sarah capitalized on his mistake by reversing her direction and achieving a perfect firing solution with her 20 cannon. The short burst of armor-piercing shells found their target, sending the MiG-23 spiraling toward the earth in flames. The destruction of the first Soviet aircraft had a profound psychological effect on the remaining pilots, who realized that they were not facing an amateur or support pilot as they had initially assumed. Radio communications between the MiGs became more cautious and coordinated as they recognized that their opponent possessed combat skills that demanded serious respect and careful tactical planning. Sarah felt a surge of confidence mixed with grim determination as she scored her first aerial victory. However, she knew that destroying one aircraft had actually made her situation more dangerous, because the remaining Soviet pilots would now approach the engagement with deadly seriousness rather than overconfidence. The element of surprise that had served her well during the initial phase of the combat was now gone. The second engagement began when two MiG-29s attempted a coordinated missile attack from different directions. Sarah detected the launches on her radar warning receiver and immediately deployed countermeasures while executing a complex defensive maneuver that involved rapid changes in both direction and altitude. The Soviet missiles, confused by her chaff and flare dispensers, detonated harmlessly in the empty air behind her rapidly maneuvering aircraft. Using the momentum from her defensive maneuvers, Sarah reversed course and dove on one of the MiG-29s whose pilot was still recovering from his failed missile shot. The Soviet aviator, caught off guard by the sudden reversal, attempted to escape by diving toward the deck at maximum speed. Sarah followed him down, matching his every maneuver while slowly closing the distance between their aircraft. The chase lasted nearly 5 minutes and covered almost 50 miles of German airspace as both pilots pushed their aircraft to the edge of structural failure. The MiG-29 pilot was skilled and desperate, using every defensive tactic in the Soviet fighter pilot handbook to escape his pursuer. However, Sarah's superior knowledge of her opponent's capabilities allowed her to anticipate his moves and gradually gain position for a killing shot. The final phase of Sarah Martinez's legendary engagement began with Major's decision to personally engage the NATO pilot who had destroyed 3 of his squadron's aircraft. The veteran Soviet aviator had studied his opponent's tactics during the previous exchanges and believed he had identified weaknesses that could be exploited by a pilot of his experience and skill level. What he failed to understand was that Sarah had been studying his flying patterns as well, preparing for the inevitable one-on-one confrontation that would determine the outcome of the entire engagement. Sarah's fuel gauge showed critical levels as she maneuvered her F-16 into position for what she knew would be her final engagement before NATO reinforcements arrived. Her aircraft had perhaps 5 minutes of combat flying time remaining, after which she would be forced to disengage regardless of the tactical situation. The mathematics of aerial warfare were unforgiving, and even the most skilled pilot could not overcome the basic physics of fuel consumption and aircraft endurance. Major approached the engagement with the confidence of a hunter who had cornered his prey. His MiG-29 was faster in straight-line acceleration and possessed slightly better climb performance than the American F-16, advantages that he planned to exploit in a vertical engagement that would force his opponent to burn fuel rapidly while trying to match his energy state. The Soviet pilot had no idea that his opponent was a woman whose knowledge of MiG-29 capabilities exceeded that of most NATO intelligence analysts. The opening moves of their aerial duel took place at 30,000 feet above the German countryside, with both aircraft maneuvering for position while attempting to deny their opponent any tactical advantage. Sarah used her F-16's superior turning radius to avoid its initial attack, forcing the Soviet pilot to overshoot and giving her a brief opportunity to reverse their positions. The exchange lasted only seconds, but demonstrated to both pilots that they were facing a worthy opponent. Second attack came in the form of an AA-11 Archer missile launched from maximum range, as Sarah attempted to climb away from his pursuing MiG-29. The infrared-guided weapon tracked perfectly toward her F-16's engine exhaust, forcing her to deploy countermeasures while executing violent evasive maneuvers that pushed her aircraft to its structural limits. The missile detonated harmlessly after being successfully decoyed, but the explosion occurred close enough to shower her aircraft with fragments that damaged several non-critical systems. Sarah realized that her opponent was not making the same tactical errors that had doomed his wingmen. Major was flying with the precision and patience of a veteran combat pilot who understood how to use his aircraft's advantages while minimizing exposure to her superior gunnery skills. The engagement had evolved into a chess match played at supersonic speeds, where a single mistake by either pilot would prove fatal. The breakthrough moment came when Sarah recognized a pattern in his defensive maneuvers that revealed his preference for right-hand turns when evading pursuit. This slight tactical tendency was exactly the kind of detail that her analytical mind had been trained to identify and exploit. She began setting up an engagement geometry that would force the Soviet pilot to choose between exposing himself to cannon fire or accepting an unfavorable position that would compromise his ability to employ his own weapons effectively. Fell for the trap when Sarah appeared to make an aggressive move that left her aircraft exposed to his missiles. The Soviet pilot immediately maneuvered to exploit what he believed was a tactical error, unaware that Sarah had deliberately created the appearance of vulnerability while maintaining a defensive option that she was prepared to execute at the precise moment necessary. Her strategy required perfect timing and complete confidence in her aircraft's performance capabilities. The decisive moment arrived when committed to a missile shot that required him to maintain a steady course for several crucial seconds. Sarah waited until the last possible instant before executing a high-G barrel roll that not only evaded the incoming AA-11, but also positioned her F-16 directly behind the MiG-29 in perfect firing position. The Soviet pilot realized his mistake too late, finding himself trapped in Sarah's gun sight with insufficient time or energy to escape. Sarah's final cannon burst was a masterpiece of precision marksmanship that found its target despite the extreme maneuvering of both aircraft. The 20 armor-piercing shells penetrated the MiG-29's engine bay, causing catastrophic damage that sent the Soviet fighter tumbling toward the earth in an uncontrollable spin. Major managed to eject successfully, but his aircraft was completely destroyed, giving Sarah her fourth confirmed kill of the engagement. The remaining Soviet aircraft immediately disengaged and fled toward friendly territory as NATO reinforcements finally arrived in the engagement area. The fresh American pilots were astonished to discover that a single F-16 had not only survived an encounter with 8 enemy fighters, but had actually achieved 4 confirmed kills while operating alone against overwhelming odds. The radio frequency filled with incredulous questions as the reinforcing pilots tried to understand what had transpired during their absence. Sarah's voice was calm and professional as she reported her tactical situation to the arriving NATO aircraft, though her hands were shaking from adrenaline and physical exhaustion. Her fuel situation was now beyond critical, with barely enough remaining to attempt a landing at the nearest friendly airfield. The successful completion of her mission had pushed both her aircraft and her own endurance to their absolute limits. The flight back to air base was surreal as Sarah processed the magnitude of what she had accomplished. 4 confirmed kills against Soviet MiG-29s and MiG-23s represented more aerial victories than most fighter pilots achieved during entire careers. Her performance had not only exceeded everyone's expectations, but had established her as one of the finest combat pilots of her generation, regardless of gender or previous assignment. Colonel Harrison was waiting on the flight line when Sarah's battle-damaged F-16 touched down, with fuel gauges reading empty and multiple systems showing yellow and red warning lights. The aircraft had absorbed significant punishment during the engagement, but had performed flawlessly when it mattered most. Ground crews immediately began documenting the battle damage, while intelligence officers prepared to debrief Sarah about every detail of her remarkable encounter. The debriefing session lasted nearly 8 hours, as Sarah provided minute-by-minute details of her engagement with the Soviet aircraft. Intelligence analysts were particularly interested in her observations about MiG-29 performance characteristics and Soviet tactics, information that would prove invaluable for training future NATO pilots. Her photographic memory and technical knowledge allowed her to provide insights that exceeded the quality of most combat reports. News of Sarah's achievement spread rapidly through the NATO command structure, reaching the highest levels of military leadership within hours of her return. However, the classified nature of the engagement and the military's policies regarding women in combat meant that her heroic actions would remain officially unrecognized for decades. She had become an ace pilot in a war that did not officially exist, fighting an enemy that both sides preferred to forget. Captain, who had safely returned to base despite his aircraft's damage, was among the first to congratulate Sarah on her unprecedented achievement. The veteran pilot admitted that he had never seen flying skills comparable to what she had demonstrated during the engagement, and he became one of her strongest advocates for recognition and advancement within the fighter pilot community. The Soviet Union never officially acknowledged the engagement or the loss of 4 aircraft, maintaining the fiction that no combat had occurred despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Major, after his rescue and repatriation, reportedly expressed grudging respect for the unknown NATO pilot who had outfought his entire squadron. Soviet intelligence agencies launched intensive efforts to identify the mysterious aviator, never suspecting that their nemesis was a woman who had been considered unsuitable for combat roles. Sarah's life changed dramatically in the weeks following her aerial victories, though the changes remained largely invisible to the outside world. She was quietly transferred to a classified test pilot program where her skills could be fully utilized without violating official policies about women in combat. Her new assignment allowed her to continue flying high-performance aircraft while contributing to the development of advanced fighter tactics and technologies. The military establishment struggled to reconcile Sarah's achievements with their existing beliefs about gender roles in combat aviation. Some officials argued for immediate policy changes to allow qualified women to serve as fighter pilots, while others insisted that her case was an anomaly that should not influence broader military doctrine. The debate would continue for years, with Sarah's mission serving as evidence for both sides of the argument. Years later, when the classified details of her engagement were finally, Sarah Martinez emerged as a symbol of courage and excellence that transcended gender barriers. Her story inspired a new generation of female aviators who followed her path from support roles to frontline combat positions. The invisible pilot who had been dismissed by her male colleagues had proven that skill and determination were more important than preconceived notions about who could serve their country in the cockpit of a fighter jet. The 4 silver stars painted on the side of Sarah's aircraft represented more than aerial victories. They symbolized the shattering of barriers that had prevented countless qualified women from serving their country in combat roles. Her mission over Germany had lasted less than an hour, but its impact on military aviation would be felt for generations to come. The support crew member had become an ace, and in doing so, had changed the world of military aviation forever. The legend of the pilot who downed 4 MiGs in a single mission would be passed down through squadron-ready rooms and flight training schools for decades, inspiring countless aviators to push beyond their perceived limitations. However, those who knew the full story understood that Sarah Martinez's greatest victory was not against Soviet aircraft, but against the prejudice and institutional barriers that had nearly prevented her from proving her worth as one of the finest fighter pilots of any generation. The second Soviet fighter fell to a perfectly executed high-deflection shot that caught the MiG-29 as it attempted to escape through a high-speed climbing turn. Sarah's cannon shells penetrated the enemy aircraft's fuel system, creating a spectacular explosion that illuminated the afternoon sky. The MiG pilot managed to eject safely, but his aircraft was completely destroyed, leaving 6 Soviet fighters to continue the pursuit. Major watched the destruction of his second wingman with growing respect for his unknown opponent. In his extensive combat experience, he had never encountered a NATO pilot capable of achieving 2 kills against superior numbers while operating alone in hostile airspace. He began to formulate new tactics designed specifically to counter his opponent's aggressive flying style and exceptional marksmanship skills. Sarah's fuel situation was becoming critical as the engagement entered its 20th minute. Her aircraft's internal fuel tanks were nearly empty, and she would soon be forced to choose between continuing the fight and ensuring that she had sufficient fuel to return safely to friendly territory. The Soviet pilots were undoubtedly aware of her fuel limitations and were likely planning to exploit this vulnerability in their next attack. The third Soviet aircraft to fall victim to Sarah's marksmanship was a MiG-23 whose pilot made the fatal mistake of attempting a head-on attack against the F-16's superior cannon system. The Soviet pilot apparently believed that his aircraft's heavier armament would give him an advantage in a direct confrontation. However, Sarah's superior gunnery skills and her aircraft's more advanced fire control system proved decisive in the brief but violent exchange. The head-on engagement lasted only seconds, with both aircraft approaching each other at a combined speed exceeding 1,000 miles per hour. Sarah opened fire first, her 20 cannon shells finding their target just as the Soviet pilot began his own gun run. The MiG-23 disintegrated in a ball of fire and debris, while Sarah's F-16 sustained minor damage from fragments but remained fully controllable. 3 confirmed kills against overwhelming odds had transformed Sarah from an unknown support pilot into a legend in the making. However, the surviving Soviet aircraft were now approaching the engagement with deadly coordination and tactical sophistication that would test every aspect of her flying abilities. The most dangerous phase of the aerial battle was about to begin, as fuel constraints and ammunition limitations threatened to tip the odds decisively against her. The radio frequency suddenly erupted with new communications as NATO reinforcements finally arrived within range of the engagement area. 2 fresh F-16s were approaching rapidly from the west, followed by additional aircraft that would soon transform the tactical balance of the aerial battle. Sarah realized that she only needed to survive a few more minutes before help arrived, but those minutes would require her to face the most experienced and dangerous Soviet pilots with nearly empty fuel tanks and limited ammunition remaining. Major made his final decision as he prepared to engage the NATO pilot who had humiliated his squadron and destroyed 3 of his aircraft. This would be a personal duel between 2 of the finest fighter pilots of their generation, fought in the unforgiving arena of the sky where only one could emerge victorious. The invisible support crew member had become the most visible target in European airspace, and her greatest challenge was yet to come. Sarah broke from her defensive posture and maneuvered aggressively toward the Soviet fighter's engaging captain. Her movement caught the attention of the remaining MiGs, who immediately shifted their focus to intercept her before she could interfere with their coordinated attack on her wingman. The tactical situation had evolved into a deadly game of chess played at supersonic speeds with missiles instead of pieces. The first MiG-29 to engage Sarah was piloted by a veteran Soviet aviator with extensive combat experience from the Afghanistan conflict. He approached the engagement with confidence, expecting to make quick work of what he assumed was an inexperienced NATO pilot who had made the tactical error of abandoning a defensive position. He had no way of knowing that his opponent was a woman whose flying abilities exceeded those of most male pilots in either air force. Sarah's first evasive maneuver caught the Soviet pilot completely off guard. Instead of attempting to outrun or outclimb the pursuing MiG-29, she executed a split-S maneuver that reversed her direction while trading altitude for airspeed. The unexpected tactic forced the Soviet pilot to overshoot his intended attack position, giving Sarah a brief opportunity to assess the tactical situation and plan her next move. The radio frequency was filled with urgent communications as both sides called for reinforcements and updated their tactical picture of the developing aerial battle. NATO ground controllers were frantically vectoring additional fighters toward the engagement area, while Soviet commanders were apparently debating whether to escalate further or order their aircraft to withdraw before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Sarah used every ounce of her flying skill to avoid the missiles and cannon fire from multiple MiGs while searching for an opportunity to assist Captain, who was still fighting for his life against overwhelming odds. The aerial combat had scattered across dozens of miles of airspace, with individual engagements occurring simultaneously at different altitudes and locations. The complexity of the situation would have challenged even the most experienced combat pilots. As fuel levels began to reach critical minimums for all aircraft involved, Sarah realized that the engagement would need to be resolved quickly one way or another. The Soviet pilots were undoubtedly aware of the same constraint and would likely attempt to achieve decisive results before their own fuel situation forced them to disengage. The next few minutes would determine whether she and Captain would survive to return to base or become casualties in an undeclared aerial war. The invisible pilot who had walked unnoticed through the corridors of Air Base was now locked in mortal combat with some of the world's most dangerous fighter aircraft. Her moment of truth had arrived, and everything she had learned about flying and fighting would be tested in the crucible of aerial warfare where mistakes were measured in milliseconds and paid for with human lives. The takeoff was flawless, and within minutes both F-16s were climbing rapidly through the cold morning air toward their assigned altitude. Sarah checked her instruments and weapon systems, confirming that everything was functioning normally. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, executing the pre-combat checklist that she had memorized years earlier but never expected to use in an actual confrontation. Ground control radar provided regular updates on the position and heading of the Soviet aircraft, which appeared to be maintaining their course toward the NATO communications facility. Intelligence analysts on the ground were frantically trying to determine whether this was a deliberate provocation, a navigation error, or the beginning of a larger military operation that could escalate into armed conflict. As the two F-16s approached the intercept coordinates, Captain radioed final instructions to Sarah about maintaining proper formation spacing and communication protocols. The next few minutes would determine whether this mission would end with a peaceful escort to the border or escalate into the kind of aerial combat that neither pilot had ever experienced outside of training scenarios. Sarah acknowledged her wingman's instructions and checked her radar display one final time before the intercept began. 4 hostile contacts appeared on her screen, exactly matching the intelligence briefing they had received before takeoff. The Soviet pilots were flying in a standard finger-4 formation, indicating professional military training and tactical awareness that would make them dangerous opponents if the situation turned violent. The moment of truth was rapidly approaching, and Sarah knew that everything she had learned about flying and fighting was about to be tested in the most unforgiving environment possible. The invisible support pilot was about to step onto the center stage of international conflict, armed with nothing but her skills, her courage, and an unshakable belief in her ability to succeed against overwhelming odds. She knew that her skills were being wasted in a support role, while some of the less experienced male pilots were assigned to frontline combat duties. However, she also understood that challenging the system directly would likely result in her being transferred to a non-flying position altogether. Instead, she focused on becoming the best support pilot possible while secretly preparing herself for the day when circumstances might give her the opportunity to prove her worth in combat. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. During a routine maintenance inspection, Sarah discovered a critical flaw in the navigation system of one of the squadron's F-16s. Her attention to detail and technical knowledge helped prevent what could have been a catastrophic failure during a combat mission. This incident earned her recognition from the squadron commander, Colonel James Harrison, who began to pay closer attention to her contributions to the unit's operational readiness. Colonel Harrison was a pragmatic officer who cared more about results than politics. He had served in Vietnam and understood that in combat situations, the military's rigid hierarchies often had to give way to practical necessity. When he reviewed Sarah's service record and pilot evaluations, he was impressed by her consistently outstanding performance ratings and her deep understanding of combat tactics. The colonel began including Sarah in more advanced briefings and training exercises, though still within her official capacity as a support pilot. He wanted to see how she would handle the pressure and complexity of combat planning without formally acknowledging that he was testing her potential as a fighter pilot. Sarah rose to every challenge, demonstrating tactical thinking and situational awareness that impressed even the most skeptical members of the squadron. As December 1987 approached, intelligence reports indicated that the Soviets were planning a major military exercise near the border. NATO commanders prepared for the possibility that this exercise might be a cover for more aggressive actions. The tension had reached its highest level since the Cuban Missile Crisis, with pilots sleeping in their flight suits and aircraft maintained in a constant state of readiness. Sarah felt the weight of anticipation along with everyone else at the base. She had no idea that in just a few days, a combination of circumstances would thrust her into the most challenging situation of her military career. The invisible pilot was about to become very visible indeed, though not in the way anyone expected. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Sarah had learned about flying and fighting. The Soviet MiG-29s were waiting beyond the horizon, their pilots confident in their superior numbers and advanced technology. The weather was turning harsh, with winter storms creating dangerous flying conditions that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. In her quarters that night, Sarah reviewed her flight manuals one more time, unaware that within 48 hours, all of her preparation and training would be put to the ultimate test. The support crew member was about to become the star of her own incredible story, one that would be remembered in aviation circles for decades to come.